When you think of a shared universe, your mind tends to go towards Marvel, Star Wars, or even now DC. However, there's a franchise which has been quietly succeeding in the background, maintaining an ongoing successful franchise, that being the Conjuring universe. Now, as you'll see in this list, the films aren't actually that good. However, the success is generated through consistent box office performances where the films will make an insane profit from quite a low budget. This has led to a franchise consisting of 10 feature-length films, with The Conjuring: The Last Rites serving as the latest addition. It is advertised as the final mainline Conjuring film, but given the inevitable success of these films, I'm sure the franchise will not be ending with it. The question for this video is, where will it rank amongst its fellow editions? Only one way to find out. The Curse of La Llorona is very detached from this franchise, which could be served as an advantage for this film, given that it didn't have to try and connect into what has come before, yet this film just shows that it is the dark horse of the franchise, as it doesn't really offer anything and makes you question why it even exists, or whether this source material comes from folklore or legends. And to be honest, I think it's been better adapted in the TV show Grimm. If you just think of generic horror, you have that right here. The scares, if you can call them that, are very lackluster and unimaginative, and not to mention any sort of tension can never really properly brew, given that there's just excessive editing, just like my videos. As I said, it just fails to offer anything new, and in this case, the lack of attachment to the rest of the franchise just makes it feel very alone and like it has nothing to offer, because it just relies on too many jump scares, and they're not good ones. The odd inclusion of this list is a series of shorts that released alongside The Conjuring back in 2013, and I'm just looking to include more shorts into my rankings. The 3:07 AM project actually consists of 4 different shorts, all 2 minutes long, but I've kind of combined them here and kind of determined a score and a placement from that. Given the nature of these shorts being 2 minutes long, there's not really much time to tell a proper story or develop anyone, so it's quite hard to become captivated by what is going on. I will touch briefly on all the shorts individually though. This one for the lady is the simplest of the bunch. While that tends to normally be a good thing for a short, this one just doesn't offer anything at all. The seance has a creepy atmosphere, however the excessive dialogue from its annoying characters just kind of ruin it. The box was the best in my opinion, directed by Ty West. It is very simple and just shows such creepy imagery alongside an unsettling score, but it does culminate in a very cheap jump scare. And one last dive also kind of factors in creepy imagery, this time from claustrophobia, and just the idea of a night dive seems terrifying. You know, I've done some scuba diving, but night diving just seems very creepy, and it kind of plays into that fear. Valak instantly made an impression with its appearance in The Conjuring 2, so naturally everyone was quite excited for this film, so what we got was quite disappointing in the end. I personally do have a soft spot for this film. I was quite young when I watched The Conjuring 2 with my friends over Halloween, and we found The Nun terrifying as it is. When we saw that there's a solo film dedicated to this character, I assembled a bunch of friends and we went to the cinema to see it, and keep in mind we were like 15, so it was like a big deal back then, but yeah, it was disappointing. Obviously Valak is still menacing, creepy here, but the film just doesn't offer much past that. Yes, the scenery and imagery can be atmospheric as well, but its characters have no depth. The jump scares seem a bit lazy, and also just past that, there's no real meat to the story. So despite the potential and the terrifying main character, this horror film just feels very empty and just bland overall. And to be honest, the same can be said about its sequel, The Nun 2. A slight improvement, yes, but still very bland and doesn't offer much. I said there is a small improvement. It's not enough to fix the criticisms, you know, there's a little bit more character development, and I will admit there are some solid scares, but still the story just feels empty and it's hard to latch onto it. Where the original didn't really offer much in terms of story, this film attempted to do a bit too much. It couldn't really decide which avenue to take. You know, 1 minute it was a mystery, 1 minute it was a horror, and then it kind of scrapped the mystery by the end. But this would affect the structure and tone and pacing of the entire thing, as you're having to adapt to the two different tones whenever it would jump between characters. So while this is better than the original Nun, it hardly is, because there's still so much untapped potential with the Valak character. Cherish is the word I use to describe. The worst of the Annabelle films happens to be the original, and it's not always you can say that with a trilogy, but yes, Annabelle was the weakest of that trilogy, just because nothing really happens. It's a very simple plot, but the tension and scares crafted are very lazy and cheap. I mean cheap by the fact that, you know, there's silence and it's clear that something's coming, but then it just drastically changes the music or sound effects, so it's really loud, so naturally you're gonna jump a little bit. That's just how humans work. It didn't feel earned and just overall was quite lazy. The scenarios are pretty much all the same, as it's just focusing on this pregnant lady and eventually mother, spoiler alert. It didn't feel like a massive threat, or at least not an exciting one for us. It sounds a bit demonic to say. There's just a severe lack of anything interesting, and when the scares do happen, they just don't feel satisfying at all. Annabelle creation kind of suffers the same fate as the original Annabelle. There just not being too much going on, or at least nothing really original. Yes, there is some potential with the Warren's museum coming to life, but again, that's not really utilised in an exciting way. It only scratches the surface. Good character development is hard to come by in horror films, especially in this franchise as of late, but I actually think that Annabelle Comes Home did a decent enough job in the beginning with certain characters. There's not many characters in this film, but they set up their ones fairly well, but ultimately undo it all through just the characters making stupid decisions which are needed to progress the plot. So again, just lazy writing. McKenna Grace continues to be the face of childhood actors within the horror genre, because she's the standout, and obviously she's a kid in this film. So yeah, unfortunately the narrative flow did keep disrupting her performance, but the scenes there she was allowed to act, she did a good job. A simple horror plot can go one or two ways. You can make a very decent, compact film, or a very forgettable one. And the latter is certainly the case here, with Annabelle Comes Home just not handling its potential in any sort of way, instead going for the cliches and relying on some stupid decisions from the characters to help move the plot along. We can't go on together with suspicious minds. I remember just coming out of lockdown and this was one of the new films to be released, and I was very excited for it, but the lack of James Wan in the director's chair does show, because this stumbles towards being more of a generic horror film than something special like one had previously done. Now the pacing for this film is good, but the plot I wasn't super invested in. There were some cool moments, however unsatisfying reveals. Just through the general concept of it, it was hard to get emotionally invested or feel the tension, because I'll try not to spoil it, but just the way it wraps up I felt quite unsatisfied with. There are still some strong things in here, some decent scares, but the highlight again, Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga being this infamous couple who are portrayed as the media darlings in this film. But yeah, the writing just wasn't as strong, and yes, that's partially through the new staff behind the camera, but also the story itself, as I said, just wasn't as exciting. The environment wasn't as intimate or intense, so I just didn't really feel that magic or investment that I had before. It's still, you know, an okay average horror film. Next up, we do have the newly released Conjuring Last Rites, and for a film which is supposed to be the big finale, this was quite a safe and familiar ending. As always, Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson are the standouts with their chemistry and individual performances, and it was nice to see an older Judy get more involved. However, that family dynamic took up way too much of the runtime and drastically slowed it down. You know, this is a film which is like 2 hours and 15 minutes long. A Conjuring film doesn't really need to reach that length. I know you could argue the second one does, however, that one had a lot more meat to it, whereas this one was very much more straightforward, but it was just stretched out full of unnecessary side plots which really damaged the overall experience. You know, the film was already quite bloated, but then it had to skip over essential context and just a massive time jump which was out of place in this film, and through that you just lose more interest, you lose the investment because it's prioritizing unnecessary family drama. Even past those annoyances, this film is just full of cliches, and I know it takes partial inspiration from real life events, but some of them are just very generic and aspects you've seen in other films before, and other films have done it better. You know, it's not just a formulaic film of the horror genre, haunted house to be more specific, but it's also just very familiar within this genre. We've seen this type of film done before in this franchise, and it's just quite dull by this point. Yes, there are some clever scares where they use the environment to its advantage, but there's also some very cheap ones, whether they're predictable or just where the drastic change in volume obviously gets a reaction out of you. Look, it's not a terrible film by any means, it's better than The Devil Made Me Do It in my opinion. However, it was just very safe, dull, and just way too long. It does wrap up in a satisfying way, and if you're a big fan of the franchise, it does have some nice little fan service for you, but other than that, it's just a very bland finale.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine.
This was such a big surprise at the time, but Annabelle Creation is the best of the trilogy, and it kind of just fixes everything that that original film did wrong. It changes the environment and makes it feel very intimate. It has characters that you actually care about and are concerned for their safety, especially given the disabilities one of them has. It's just a fresh experience. The shocking and unforgiving tone is set from the first minute, and the rest of the film follows that, creating this unsettling atmosphere which just carried through right till the credits. Trying to follow up an unsuccessful film can always be challenging when you're trying to improve upon it, but this film, well, it is a prequel, but it drastically changes everything about it, as I said, but still manages to find ways to tie back into it, and through that actually makes Annabelle a bit better as well. I think this is a perfect example of where the Annabelle doll has been used to its potential. There's some truly terrifying imagery, unsettling scenarios, characters that you care about, and yeah, just the tone and environment just make it quite a unique experience, and definitely the best of the Annabelle films.
Falling in love with
While The Conjuring 2 kind of just reskins the original a bit, I still really enjoyed it, and I found the family more compelling this time around. They were depicted in an immense struggle, yet they stuck together as a family would, and it's just very unfortunate that these paranormal events are happening to them. It's actually really surprising to see how good this one is, considering how poor horror sequels tend to be, especially when they're following up a successful film. But I thought the mystery here was just as intriguing. Obviously, this is the debut of the nun, Valak, who steals the show by the end with just menacing presence. However, where it's tied in with the nun at the end, it can be a bit of a sillier ending. Maybe not silly, but doesn't pay off as much in a satisfying way, as it goes quite CGI heavy and shows you a lot of the stuff where before it would kind of imply things or subtly reveal them. So yeah, despite this being just a bit of a reskin of the original, I think it works in this scenario. It's always nice to see a bit of England representation here, and I liked how they progressed the Warrens, and as well as the dynamic of the struggling family in this film.
It's the time of the season for love.
But coming in at first place was always going to be the original Conjuring, and the film that started this franchise, but ultimately hasn't had one which has lived up to it since. Now, I mentioned earlier on in the video, executing a simple premise can be a good thing or a bad thing. In this case, it's a very good thing, because while it's not an insanely ambitious project, it is very well executed through just tension, scares, and just interesting characters. This was one of the very first horror films I saw as well, so it has a very special place in my heart. It's just such a tense experience, and it can be quite unbearable at times, where it lingers on these shots or slowly builds up to the jump scares, which, by the way, are very well earned and pay off massively, whether it's the clapping scene or the cupboard scene. There are so many strong moments which just make me really enjoy this film whilst also being terrified watching it. It's a very simple premise which just executed flawlessly with some strong characters, terrifying scares, and just a consistent pace throughout it all. So that was my ranking of all 10 theatrically released Conjuring films, including the one short film, which in itself had a lot of shorts, so kind of a Inception sort of thing there. This was obviously advertised as the last mainline Conjuring film, but I don't know what the rest of this franchise has in store going forward. As of now, I hope you did enjoy this video. Let me know what your ranking is down below, and while you're there, if you could like and subscribe, that would be great. I have a bunch of other rankings up in the corner here if you want to check those out. But as for now, I hope you did enjoy this video, and I hope to see you in my next ranking.